Welcome to the Dark Souls 2 section of this video series where I review every Soulsborne boss. Dark Souls 2 is an interesting game to cover because I've been a certified Dark Souls 2 hater for a while now, and I mean a really long time. But there's a bit of a story in this video, a character arc if you will. The longer I played Dark Souls 2, the more I liked it? I don't know, this was a weird game to play through. The DLC in Dark Souls 2 is notorious for being really good, and it's still great to this day. Dark Souls 2 may be the ugly duckling of the family, but let me make something abundantly clear. For what Dark Souls 2 is, it's good. Souls games do not need Miyazaki to be successful, and if you know anything about Dark Souls 2, you would have heard about the troubled development this game went through within From Software and Miyazaki's minimal involvement. He was mainly working on Bloodborne, and FromSoft was at a maximum overload when this game was in development, as Dark Souls 3 would come out one single year after Bloodborne. So FromSoft were probably working on 3 games internally, 2 of them being a Dark Souls game. But I am going to give Dark Souls 2 fans a W. I don't think it's bad, not terrible, and it's better than every other Souls-like on the market. Well, that was a lie. One Souls-like is better than Dark Souls 2, but I'll let you decide on which one that is. And that might speak to the quality of this game. Souls-likes have had a lot more time to study other games on the market, yet they still come out to be fucking garbage. So yeah, Dark Souls 2 fans have earned a W. It has a lot of issues, and I will talk about those issues in the video. But for now, I have a lot of bosses to get through, so let's get to it. Dark Souls 2 starts off really strong by allowing the player to have multiple bosses they tackle first, almost similar to Dark Souls 1. So unless I'm lacking the proper knowledge to find the other boss, you can fight 3 different bosses in whichever order you please. I love that we get to choose which boss we want to fight first. It's just a shame that the last giant is a pitiful boss, and he's what most people will do first. Mechanically, Asylum Demon wasn't much better, but at least FromSoft added some spectacle by forcing you to run away or doing the plunging attack. The last giant stomps his feet like he's a child having a mental breakdown and drags his arm across the ground. These aren't fun to dodge or interact with. But as it is said, better late than never. A little halfway through the fight, our giant boy will rip his arm off and alter his moveset for a second phase, although barely anything changes as he still slides his arm across the ground. Dark Souls 2 really does have some of the worst bosses in the franchise, and the beginner bosses really flash that idea. The Pursuer is one of the stronger bosses in Dark Souls 2 with plenty of great ideas thrown into his boss kit. Almost everything From Software did with him feels unique and special. The fact you will find him when you are exploring levels somewhat hypes up his real fight. From Software really did take this idea that the Pursuer started and put that idea into the Ring City with Midir. Another neat thing I learned from a YouTube video by the YouTuber Parker the Rat is when he impales you on his sword, he unlocks a brand new ability that unleashes dark magic on the player. What a fucking awesome idea. I simply cannot think of a time that an idea like this has been thrown into a game before Dark Souls 2. By the time you get around to his real boss encounter, it's even better. He acts for a great skill check for players that want to test their might with their parry skills. Not only does it give them a challenge for parrying a boss, but this boss also does a great job at nudging at you with the idle harpoons in his boss arena. It can even shoo players away from investing into that playstyle if they are not grasping the time as easily as they thought they would. And landing that perfect parry is heavily rewarded and can essentially wipe out almost all of his health bar in one go. The ideas that are surrounding the Pursuer are better than the mechanics of the fight itself, and that's a welcome addition. Unique mechanics are still something that I will remember years from now, but a mid-tier boss will be forgotten within a matter of weeks. Old Dragonslayer is Ornstein from Dark Souls 1 without Smo. You know, the other half to this boss, the two that were designed to work together. Well, at least I can say that I was right on the money when I said that Ornstein and Smo feel like a good boss quality because Old Dragonslayer is one of the better base game mechanical fights in Dark Souls 2. I just wish they would have made this boss more of a worthwhile fight. Take an already solid boss moveset foundation and expand on ideas that we have. I find it hard to believe that cut moves or ideas from Dark Souls 1 couldn't have been added to this fight. Worst of all, he feels balanced around an extremely early game character. The issue that I take with this is that getting to him is a chore. There's hordes of enemies leading up to him and a dragon that I sadly forgot to get footage of. So the run back is arguably harder than the boss, and if you do decide to do this boss later, you will come back and you will be overleveled. You will be so overleveled that you can practically breathe on him and he will die. And when that does happen, you ruined one of the few strong base game mechanical bosses by no fault of your own. It really is a shame because this boss fight is decent and FromSoft opted to make this game annoying instead of fun. Dark Souls 2 is notorious for this. Darklurker and some of the DLC bosses do this exact same horrible idea. Alright, I'm going to compliment Dragonrider. One of the few strengths that is in Dark Souls 2 is the fact that it plays with a lot of new ideas. That statement can be supported by the fact that Miyazaki didn't have much input on what was going on with Dark Souls 2, as he was mainly focusing on Bloodborne. Dragonrider's boss arena can be altered depending on how thoroughly you explore the level leading up to him. You can raise 2 platforms, making it much harder to accidentally roll off. If you choose to not raise the platform, you can easily fall off, similar to the Iron Golem boss fight in Dark Souls 1. With just a few movement mistakes, you will die to gravity. Of course, Dragonrider doesn't have an interesting moveset to fight. Most of the older games by this point in their lives don't really hold up in that department. He is, however, slightly more engaging than the last giant, although that's not saying much, but I think his arena is a golden idea that should be iterated upon in the newer games. So I've made it very clear in this video series that I am a freak and I usually enjoy gank type bosses in Dark Souls games. I've definitely levied a lot of criticism towards Dark Souls 2, and what may come as a surprise is that I actually kind of like this boss. Dark Souls 2 is filled to the brim with quirky ideas, and deciding to throw in 3 enemies into an arena with what seems to be a shared moveset between the 3 kind of worked out. What will be the most controversial statement within the Dark Souls 2 section of this video series is that, I generally don't hate the enemy spam that some bosses, but mostly levels have. It can go a bit overboard at times, I will not lie, but the act of unlocking my camera and choosing the right time to fight has always been a combat strategy that speaks loudly to me. I think that some of these ideas can work the best in Dark Souls 2 since you can effectively have unlimited healing with life gems, and it does force a switch up from the normal combat rhythm that we saw in Dark Souls 1. From Software placed these 3 enemies early enough into the game itself that if you are struggling with, or simply think they're bullshit, you can leave similar to Margit and Elden Ring, and come back with little to no pushback on their side. You will out-DPS them and you can beat them with your eyes closed. A proper gank fight like we saw in Dark Souls 1 was so well designed that their difficulty was appropriate for their placement. Even though I do enjoy fighting these 3, do not let me persuade you. By no means are these 3 better than the actual well-designed fights such as Bellfry Gargoyles or the duo Double of Trouble and Anne Orlando. I just happen to enjoy fighting multiple enemies, and I think From Software appropriately placed them in the game itself. While I do enjoy fighting multiple enemies, I do not enjoy bullshit. Because Bellfry Gargoyles is a lazy and poorly executed set of bosses that are borderline bullshit and offensive. Not only was it a bad idea to place these guys right after a gank fight, but it's a worse gank fight in every measurable way. Just like Dark Souls 2 is a sequel. At least the Sentinels boss fight was a new idea From Software experimented with. Bellfry Gargoyles is a fight that is 100% worse, and it has no right to be, saying that this fight has already been done successfully once. Most of the moves from the original fight feels pasted into here, but instead of 2, you can fight up to 3. Oh boy, that's fun. I am very much so okay with waiting for my time to attack, but with 3 enemies that have attacks that can stack on top of each other, it feels like the time that I do have to attack is so rare and minimal, and I may as well hit trade my way through with life gems to save my ass. I wouldn't be so hard on the fight if it wasn't so long, but you will end up killing 5 total gargoyles. All of them look the same, and I'm almost certain they have the same moveset. At least there was a unique feeling with old Dragonslayer. It was a slightly updated AI, and he felt like a boss-worthy opponent. These guys are nothing more than a lazy slop reuse. I can't even cut off their tails for a cool extrinsic reward, making this fight utterly useless, and I will never do it again because it is optional. Flexile Sentry is one of the most forgettable bosses in Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 took the worst approach possible with their bosses, and I don't think it paid off. This game crowned the highest boss count in the Souls games prior to Elden Ring, but where these two differentiate is that Elden Ring was able to craft a lot of high quality A to S tier bosses, while Dark Souls 2 had a small handful of good bosses. Flexile Sentry is by no means my least favorite boss that we have covered, but he's also very forgettable. They have a cool idea of having 1 enemy but 2 movesets to look out for, which is an idea that hasn't been completely abandoned, as Putrescent Knight has some similar ideas in Elden Ring, since you do have to occasionally watch out for his horse charge in that boss fight. It's just a shame that these two didn't have radically different art assets on each side. Both bodies look identical, and the only asset difference that I can see is the weapon that is being wielded. Since they do have different weapons, you'd think they have 2 fun sides to interact with, but this boss is taking up more than it was able to chew, as it simply dilutes with both sides being a bore to fight. There is some good ideas here, and if we simply removed a few of the bad bosses and developed this boss more, it could have been worthwhile. But that's Dark Souls 2, and there's a lot more of that. The Lost Sinner is another interesting boss that rewards players for properly exploring the level leading up to him and offers dynamic gameplay interactions depending on his boss arena. The design ideas FromSoft had with intertwining level exploration into bosses is fucking phenomenal, and Dark Souls 2 did it far better than what Elden Ring ever attempted. Fighting the AI inside a dim boss room makes it harder to see, and according to a Google search, he will sometimes unlock your camera, which would cause you to potentially lose focus of where the boss actually is. That's all great fucking stuff. Most of Dark Souls 1's bosses are naturally a bit outdated with the passage of time, so adding in minor oddities like this goes a long way. Well, at least it does for me. Speaking of the smaller things I enjoy, I had no idea that he has this parry that he performs on me here. Little quirks like this in boss fights can sometimes go a long way when the boss moveset isn't interesting like it is here. This boss doesn't have many moves to interact with and frantically hops around to distance herself from the player. Instead of having an interesting ranged ability to throw at the player, this boss was given a thrust attack that did catch me off guard a few times during this fight. Everything surrounding the boss is better than the boss itself. The model of the boss is also one of the ugliest models I've ever seen. At the beginning of the Skeleton Lord's boss fight, you have 3 badasses descend from their thrones with style. I'm not even going to hate on it. It's genuinely a cool introduction to the boss. These 3 also look a lot more interesting than what you would see throughout most From Software levels. For how well their presentation was made, giving these guys more health similar to the trio Sentinels would have made this fight a little bit more interesting. FromSoft wouldn't even need to repeat the same gimmick that those guys had. You can let them stay somewhat unique. It's just that I can't recall finding these enemies anywhere else in the game, so it's a shame that they will be forgotten. Because this boss has some pretty good bones, but From Software just needed to tweak the numbers a bit. If my suggestion would have been implemented, I think this fight would be a lot more well-rounded, as the regular skeletons would have more effective damage if they simply threw Skittles at you rather than their balloons for weapons. I guess I can say that I like this fight slightly more than your average person. I haven't done Deacons of the Deep in Dark Souls 3 in over 2 years, but these guys feel like a better version of that concept of carving through a bunch of enemies for the kill. Oh god damn it, I think I'm complimenting Dark Souls 2 way more than I thought I would in this video. We have a big issue because I'm about to compliment Dark Souls 2 twice without complaining, because the Executioner's Chariot is a stupid but fun boss. The goal is simple and the enemies here are simple, but it's the type of boss that is better than the sum of its parts and somehow works really fucking well. Oh god, no. There's simply not that many flaws that are present here. The ads that are in the boss arena are perfectly balanced, not too many and not so few that it turns into a dull, empty marathon. By the time you reach this boss, you'll be familiar with the skeleton gimmick of needing to kill the warlock for them to permanently die, making it not frustrating and more so enjoyable. The idea of run and cover, rinse and repeat wasn't overdone here, as you only need to do this 2 or 3 times before you reach the end. Reaching the end isn't as satisfying as the build-up, but I can at least let go of that critique as you get a hell of funny animation of the horse. The horse itself isn't anything that will blow your mind, but I also don't think it's supposed to be anything cool as it's been wounded from the crash. Which makes this piss-poor AI something that I can't really critique because I love critiquing Dark Souls 2, but sadly I simply can't here, so B tier boss, it's pretty good. Alright, you silly fucks, get your Jabba the Hutt memes out for this lard ass. Covetous Demon had developer time sunk into this thing. Think of that, someone worked on this, and they were paid. I mean, I highly doubt it took a lot of developer time, but actual work was put into this boss. And you want to know what? I'd really like to see the stats of how many people died in this dude's boss arena, because if you did die, I hope your controller died, or you had a text, because that would be fucking embarrassing. I don't even know, man. I guess FromSoft got away with copyright infringement as Jabba the Hutt is canon within Dark Souls, so because of that, S tier boss. And since From Software can get away with whatever they want, let this man cook with a Berserk game. The Medusa of Dark Souls 2 has some semi-interesting gimmicks within her fight. She plays with something that I love about Dark Souls 2, and it's how the bosses can interact with the levels. But sadly, she has one of the shittiest iterations of this idea. Fighting her in the poison not only damages you, but will occasionally heal her during the encounter. Doing her fight will definitely make some people upset, as it just feels fucking unfair if you don't know that windmills are weak to fire. Yeah, this part of the windmill will just go on fire because that's totally how that works, right? An interesting idea, and I think FromSoft understands this too, as Fume Knight in the DLC is the perfected version of this idea. He doesn't feel bullshit, and finding his anti-heal totems is rewarded for proper level exploration. When you do fight her the intended way, she does feel like a pushover, making the scales, get it, scales, of this fight feel lopsided. She's an extreme challenge or you raw dog her. Somehow. I do like how she can throw her head at you, it mainly just looks funny to me, but she doesn't have much to go off of. I think it would have been interesting if she fought more with her body instead of a spear. Smelter Demon is the first boss in Dark Souls 2 that's completely unique and stands as a good mechanical fight. We've had one good 1v1 fight in this game, and that was Old Dragonslayer, an altered enemy from Dark Souls 1. The thing with Dark Souls 2 is that it understands its weaknesses pretty well, arguably better than Dark Souls 1, so FromSoft found ways to make the bosses somewhat interesting even with a lack of mechanics. Most of those ways are through level design, and I think they've been successful. How Smelter Demon functions as a good mechanical boss is with his 3 phases, and that 3 phases word is not a word I'll be using much when we get around to Elden Ring, as most bosses are 2 phases, and now that I've pointed that out to you, you're definitely thinking of bosses with more than 2 phases. The only main boss I could think of with more than 2 phases were Midra and Shadow Tree Avatar. Anyway, when Smelter Demon starts cooking, he will have a self buff that constantly drains your HP. It's not much, but this is when life gems come into play here. Life gems in Dark Souls 2 are absolutely fucking broken and are effectively unlimited healing, but if FromSoft designed their bosses in this game more around the macro knowledge of choosing which healing source you need to use, that could have been a really interesting gimmick in Dark Souls 2. Rather, they're just overpowered as fuck and dilute the game's difficulty. Smelter Demon isn't bad, he's pretty good even. I wouldn't hop on the game just to replay him, but he's not a hassle when I get around to him. Lost Izalith must have really done a number on me when I was playing Dark Souls 1 because this whole level and Old Iron King isn't far above the quality of Lost Izalith. Old Iron King is one of the least interesting bosses to interact with in this game. I can't even appreciate his large character model because I feel like my eyes are being overstimulated with orange and red colors. He's sadly nothing more than a boss of his time, as the really large character models like this were rarely done well in the older games. FromSoft clearly used Quelaag as the foundation for this boss when they were designing this fight. They must have been inspired from their past work and, of course, try holding with both hands. These two will also use their boss arena as a way to deny space and force you to understand your surroundings. Quelaag would spit lava on the ground, and Najka will burrow herself and you can only see where she is by looking at the sand, effectively denying boss arena space as you have to react to what she's doing. There is a safe zone you can cower to, but it's also not a tight dodge if this zone goes over your head. These two are different enough to justify its existence, and I don't have a strong preference for Quelaag. Quelaag uses her boss arena as a challenge in a more effective manner than what we see with Najka. The Royal Rat Authority gave me such an overwhelming release of dopamine and a strong intensity of an elated feeling when I killed this boss. Why? Because I will never, ever kill this stupid ass boss again. It was just a stupid fucking fight that was shoved into this game so you can join the Rabies Covenant. I would rather this fight didn't exist because Dark Souls 2 has plenty of bosses, but has very few quality tier bosses. But guess what? That's okay, because I ain't killing this thing again. But I'm sure our next boss will be good. Yo, FromSoft, you gave these basic ass ads a fucking boss health bar by mistake. I demand you update this ancient ass game and remove the 2 health bars at the bottom of my screen. Because this shit is not a boss, and if the standard to be a boss is this low, then we need to have a serious goddamn talk. But in all seriousness, I really don't know what the reasoning is for Dark Souls 2 to have as many bosses as it does. The only thing I can think of is it was a form of marketing back in the day, as the series was known for having epic bosses, and hearing it has more than the first game made some people think it was better. I sadly know that's how I was wired back in the day. I used to love the fact that Bethesda games like Skyrim had a near unlimited amount of content. Nowadays, it's seen as lazy trash. Oh, don't get confused. I was still talking about Bethesda. The Duke's-Deer Freja is a boss that works better thematically than mechanically. I simply cannot think of another time we saw spiders as the main theme in a Miyazaki-led game. Fighting down to her while traversing on top and through hordes of spiders reminded me of the lead up to Baal in Elden Ring. And I don't think what Dark Souls 2 did is worse than Elden Ring, as sad as that is for me to say, of course. The regular spiders in her boss arena also continue to push the atmospheric approach to this boss, as they are enemies that are not hard to kill. Most builds by this point in the game can easily one-shot them, and unless I killed Freja too fast, they do not come back once they die. This fight is not a challenge by any means. The best tactic that I found was to bait out one of her attacks and run to her other side to damage her. With a few tweaks to her fight, I think she could have been the Baal of Dark Souls 2. Adding more spiders into her boss room or even continuously spawning would have gone a long way for me. I also cannot say if Miyazaki took inspiration from this boss, as the lead up gave me such a strong feeling of Baal. But I do want to continuously hammer the point that Dark Souls 2 brings a lot of strong ideas to the table, even if they didn't always work out. Our next boss is just as strong of an idea. Ha ha! Ha 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 ha! You should see the look on your face. I got you. I know I did. No, this fight fucking sucks, and it does not have strong ideas or mechanics. This boss, if you can even call it that, is worse than obvious filler in fucking anime. It's not only good for getting your anger out, as you can bonk these Rabian-infested fucks to death. It's not even a good idea poorly executed. It's rats in a fucking room. You know what? I get why this boss exists. It's for the gaming journalists. We all know they're bad at video games, and now they can be beat a few of the bosses and say they're good at the game. From Software not only makes world-class video games, but knows how to gull those goddamn game journalists. 9 out of 10 fight, only downside is that there's too many rats. I feel like the Rotten's art direction is very questionable. He is a very ugly, grotesque model. From Software has always done a good job at making ugly things moody and oppressive, but the Rotten does none of this. I find him to be so ugly that he's hard to look at, and that's not a good thing. Mechanically, he isn't much better as it's a lot of swipes and downward thrusts with his cleaver. He rarely attacks in a combo as he usually attacks once and leaves himself wide open for a punish, making for an extremely one-note boss. Luckily, I just got off my playthrough of Dark Souls 1, and this enemy is the closest idea I could find that would resemble the Rotten, and there's more direction here. Well, at least I can pick apart elements from this random enemy that we never saw again versus a boss. His AI felt more complex than whatever the fuck FromSoft attempted with this terrible ass boss. So the Rotten is a Z tier. I don't like him. The duo Dragonriders are a great example of how all reuse is not the same. A reuse such as Genichiro is a perfect example of well done reuse. He's used more than once in that game, and each time it's different enough and blends in with the story. And then you have these two. They're not offensive such as Godskin Duo, but they're not well done either. There's no thought put into them, they kind of just exist. At least one of them is ranged to force a little bit of a difference, and I say this wholeheartedly. Dark Souls 2 would be a better game without a few bosses, and this is one of them. There wasn't much of a lead up to these guys, they kind of just haphazardly appear. Their AI is not great by any means, and they're just not that fun to fight. When I was making my Demon Souls boss video, I forgot all about our Glass Knight, and he is without a doubt the perfect blend of a good boss and a PvP boss encounter. The other attempts From Software has done with the PvP boss gimmick has never really worked for me. When you fight bosses such as this, how much you enjoy the fight will vary dramatically depending on if you get a real player or not. And since the game will lose its player base eventually, they do not have a good shelf life and you will usually end up fighting a beefed up basic AI. Looking Glass Knight blends the best of both worlds together. The moveset of the boss is interesting, and halfway through, a real player can be summoned within the boss fight itself. Sadly, the chances that you come face to face with a real human is slim to none, as Dark Souls 2 doesn't have a large player base in this day and age. But the idea is there, so I respect it for that. Luckily, the idea isn't the only thing it has, as the mechanics are strong in this fight. For a Dark Souls 2 boss, there's a lot of sword swings that force you to dodge a few times, and the amount of varied moves that this boss has is respectable. Dark Souls 2 does have a lot of knights that can be overdone at times, but this boss was a real win, and I can finally say Dark Souls 2 is the best at something. It is the best at combining PvE and PvP encounters. From Software's newer titles should incorporate what was done here. I criticized the Rotten for being awful and just hideous, and Demon of Song brings us back to something that's ugly but visually impressive. This boss has a frog-shaped body but has an extremely eerie-looking face when he pulls up his head foreskin. Mechanically, the moves this guy performs aren't that interesting, but it's the same idea that I have with Gaping Dragon in Dark Souls 1, and it's that these bosses are dated by this point, so I have to rely on the art to carry what they're capable of, making Demon of Song a not bad and not great Dark Souls 2 boss. Dark Souls 2 is filled with armored knights, and it definitely passed the bar for me with this artistic enemy approach. Level enemies are armored knights, bosses are armored knights, and so on. I think you get the point. I would have preferred something different, but I do think Velstadt works as one of the better armored knights in the base game of Dark Souls 2. He does have very high damage when he gets to his second phase, with one hit potentially knocking out half of your HP. The main thing I dislike about this boss is more so the camera, but I've never seen From Software design a boss where the camera is tilted at the angle that it is here. I know I just made all of you look at the camera angle, and to be fair, it's not that bad. I think it's something my monkey strength build brain isn't used to, so I freaked out a little bit. Realistically, trying to make the camera work in these types of games is always welcome since the camera is usually the most annoying tool that gets in your way during these games. While I do think the boss is pretty good, give me Solo Smo and I think he would be better. Those two were really ahead of their time. Trash Dark Souls 2 boss number 19, Guardian Dragon. Guardian Dragon is the type of boss that someone made and felt ashamed of their work. The person at From Software knows they have more in them, but due to limited time, they were forced to put out this trash. You know how Elden Ring made the main dragon moveset that is spammed like 100 times in that game? Well, that moveset is pretty good, it's just spammed. This moveset is shit, and I'm pretty sure it's the same goddamn dragon moveset in the level ahead. They didn't even want players to have fun with this boss as his HP is laughably low. You know, this video doesn't even contain my rants with the boring-ass level design. Instead, I just get the fun opportunity to rant about the bosses. Oh god, Dark Souls 2, what is wrong with you? Trash Dark Souls 2 boss number 20, Giant Lord. You know, someone needed to go within From Software and say, hey, you guys have a lot of game here, but most of it sucks. So why don't we just cut the worst parts of this game and focus on making the current content better? That would have been fucking nice, because this boss does most of the same shit as the last giant. He just has a sword. It's not even a cool sword, in case any of the audio-only viewers were curious. At least I'll never have to fight this pathetic-ass boss again. Trash Dark Souls 2 boss number 21, Ancient Dragon. FromSoft, what the hell is wrong with you? What were you guys thinking when this boss got approved, and why? Oh god, you won't believe me, but I beat this guy on my first try on this run. You want to know why? Because he's so shitty and so basic that if you know what you're doing in his boss arena, you essentially get an auto win. The trick to beating this boss is running at his tail when he flies in the air. That's it. Excellent counterplay. As long as you have a fire damage ring on, you should be able to tank his fire breath and fuck his face. And by his face, I mean his feet. You beat up this dude's feet so hard he dies. And I swear to fuck, his feet and fire breath are all this dude does. He legitimately doesn't even have more than 5 goddamn moves. He's that one-dimensional. And you want to know what? He looks kinda cool. Was his ginormous size the reason he has such a brain-dead AI? You have to remember, this game was made for the 360 and PS3. So with such a massive size, maybe this is why... Oh no, everyone is right. Size does not matter. I'd rather have a smaller dragon that's used better than a girthy birther. Am I such a From Software glazer that I'm trying to defend one of the worst fights in Dark Souls 2? Oh goddammit, I think I am. I guess it kinda makes sense. I mean, he's huge, duh, but everything surrounding his boss arena is so shitty and so basic that FromSoft matched the shittiness with the shitty moveset. This boss is making me question my whole life. Let's move on to another shitty Dark Souls 2 boss so I can regain my humanity. Trash Dark Souls 2 boss number... Wait, Darklurker is actually good? No, this is not what I needed right now. I have to go back to the negativity or I may lose my damn mind. Alright, I will swallow my pride and admit Darklurker is pretty good, you sly fucks from software. But I am going to complain first, since that's therapeutic for me at this point. Dark Souls 2 can't not shoot itself in its own fucking foot during the rare times it does something noteworthy. Because the run back to these two was From Software flashing their groundbreaking ideas of the DLC runbacks, and I guess it was a good idea because those were a real success. Not only do you have to do a boring ass quest that will take you at least 20 minutes to do, but each and every time you die to this hard boss, you will have to sacrifice a precious resource, a resource that allows you to use your full health bar in a game that is designed to be challenging. Oh god, this game sucks. And then, you have to kill a few ads on the way to the boss. You also can't skip these ads as the boss entrance will be blocked off. So you have to painfully do this bullshit every time. This boss really should have been the last boss in the game, as it's better than every other pile of garbage that's in the base game and even the DLC. Look, I've never given Elden Ring a compliment for its duo bosses, so I have to say that this game has better duo bosses than Elden Ring, and duo fights are some of my favorite shit in the franchise, so I always complained that we never got a good duo fight in Elden Ring. So good job Dark Souls 2, you made it to the big leagues, because these two are fucking excellent. Do not let my words persuade you. I do not think they are better than Ornstein and Smough, but they are in a very respectable category of duo bosses that work. The first half of this fight is a one-on-one encounter with the AI so you can get yourself adjusted to its moveset, and even as a 1v1 counter, it smashes 80% of the other bosses in this game. The AI actually works and has varied moves and spells. I absolutely fucking love how it has dark magic and fire spells I have to be aware of. The dark magic spell forces you to unlock your camera and mentally track 3 targets, since the dark magic spell is 2 orbs in the air. The fire spell is a very deadly trio burst of fireballs that can stun lock a late game character into being one-shot. It's deadly as hell and I fucking love it. You may think that this boss is too slow, especially with some of its laser attacks in the air, but once you get to phase 2, you can see that it was very deliberately done, since you will be dodging fireballs, lasers, goddamn everything. Oh fuck, it's great. This boss fight is also one of the most intellectually designed fights From Software has ever made. They literally doubled their assets and made it work. Why didn't Elden Ring do this exactly? Holy shit. Both of them have the same AI, but the initial kit was designed with the idea that they would eventually split and become 2, and thank god this has a health bar. Far too many bosses in Dark Souls 2 die faster than fucking Concord. There's a lot of bosses that very well could have had a 50% HP buff and it would have been for the better, but these two almost feel like an Elden Ring fight where they stick around for a while and don't hold their damage back. This boss fight is 100% the best boss in the entire fucking game, and it's a shame. It's an absolute goddamn shame that I don't hear people appreciate duo bosses anymore, as a great duo boss usually reaches highs of Ludwig, Gale, and Bale. They are such a unique experience and demand a different skill set to properly master. Whoever designed this boss fight needs a fucking raise. For all I know, it could have been Miyazaki lucky with the very little input he had on this game. It's just a shame that very few are experiencing this work of art, as this boss is annoying as hell to get to. Dark Souls 2, you pulled it off, and I could not be more proud. Unlike that one upset parent where their kid can't do anything right, but they finally did it. They finally pulled it off. This boss is fucking excellent, and if you have not done this boss, I highly recommend it, especially if you were disappointed with Elden Ring's duo fights. Vendrick is a sad, pathetic zombie that is probably more of a lore boss than anything else. His moveset is extremely limited with basic sword swipes and overhead slams. What makes him annoying to fight is the huge delay on all of his moves. All of his attacks feel like they should be coming out a second or so faster, making me always have to internally delay my dodge rolls. This could be fun, but his damage is so high that just a few bad dodge rolls will send you back to the bonfire. I'm not much of a lore guy, so please forgive me, but if I am right, and FromSoft wanted you to feel bad for this boss, I think they could have reached a happy medium very similar to Demon Souls but in reverse order. Demon Souls lets you fight old King Alonne first, who just so happens to be the best boss in that game. Then you end Demon Souls by fighting, or really attacking, King Alonne, which was just a goo that was designed to be defeated with zero pushback. We could have had the pathetic version of Vendrick then go into the Vision, or maybe it's the past, and fight the real Vendrick there. Maybe it wouldn't make complete sense to fight him, but adding a real boss like we just had with Darklurker would have gone a long way. I would have been able to compliment Dark Souls 2 2 times in a row, but lightning only ever strikes in the same place twice, and that's in Sekiro. So I gladly get to give Vendrick a thumbs down. Not great, and it downright feels impossible if you don't have most or even all of the giant souls to reduce his HP. So we're finally at our first Dark Souls 2 DLC boss, and she can be summed up as the Dark Souls 2 special. She does have a lot of great ideas in her kit, and just like the rest of Dark Souls 2, the ideas are better than her actual fight. Everything about her starts off quite nicely. She has good presentation, dialogue, and a special animation to grab her weapon. She also has a nice, varied moveset with ranged magic and melee attacks. Where her idea comes to life is when she summons help in her boss fight. I've heard she can summon pigs, but I've never seen that done once in all of my playthroughs of this game. She's always summoned 3 gold skeletons or Velstadt for me. The 3 gold skeletons are hands down the easier summon to deal with. Most of these guys will go down with just 1 or 2 hits, and strength players like myself can Thanos their ass out of existence with little effort. The Velstadt summon isn't as bad as you may think. His HP is heavily diminished, but he has the moveset of the boss itself. Usually I would complain about these two not working together, but Elana is mainly a ranged enemy, giving you the classic Dark Souls experience of forcing you to prioritize a target and put all of your eggs in one basket. I personally always take out the summon first, but it is in fact a viable tactic to only focus the boss in an attempt to burst her down. I simply wish the enemies were buffed up a bit more, or even spawning in Velstadt and the skeletons, which would absolutely force you to take your attention off of Elana. I don't think any of the DLC bosses reach the height of Darklurker from the base game, but I can absolutely say Elana is good for such an old boss. Dark Souls 2's DLCs really bring the game out of the mostly mediocre state that the base game is. Oh fucking hell, Dark Souls 2? What the hell is wrong with you? Because all 3 of these DLCs have one major flaw, and it's these shitty, depression-inducing runbacks. The 3 DLC packs that are in Dark Souls 2 are by no means bad content, but adding these into the DLC is completely unnecessary. For the launch asking price of $10, I think it's a fair deal. Honestly, pretty good even. Adding this content is a rare example of hurting the overall product, and since it is Dark Souls 2, it plays with a unique idea, and it's that these bosses and horrendous runbacks were designed with co-op in mind. Which makes sense as all the bosses are pretty hard. Sadly, this is an idea that's so bad, it's almost like no thought went into the execution. Not only do solo players have to suffer through a terrible, miserable runback, but From Software boss AI is poorly designed for multiple targets, as the AI will focus on one player, while the other player gets to do boring and unengaging gameplay of stabbing the boss in the back. So From Software made content that's a double negative. Bosses are simply not good at engaging with multiple players, and the runbacks are horrible. Even if bosses were good at playing with multiple targets, this content suffers with a poor shelf life as players will eventually move on, and most players will fight these guys solo, very similar to PvP bosses. They may be fun when the game is populated, although probably not, but it's not fun when the game dies out. God, what fucking dumb decisions these boss runbacks were. And yeah, I will be bitching about these each time they come up, because the Grave Robber Gank Squad has the least offensive goddamn runback, but it's still offensive. Almost as offensive as this terrible fucking boss. So let's talk about these pile of shits. Because not only is the runback poorly thought out and executed, but so is the boss itself. To be fair, this boss is the best boss for multiple people, but it's still really awful. These 3 don't even feel great to fight as they aren't even fucking bosses. They're NPCs shoved into a boss room. I don't recognize the other 2, so maybe they're new, but this is just Havel. No, not me. This dude is just fucking Havel. The only way these gank fuckers manage to have a lick of respect towards the player's time is with the boss arena. I can at least run in circles like I'm playing Call of Duty Zombies to heal myself, and split them apart so I can turn the tides into a 1v1 fight. The only thing that doesn't surprise me here is the fact that my hands didn't cramp up while I was typing my rant for this section of the video. This is flat out one of the worst bosses From Software has made, and reasons like this is why I have Dark Souls 2 at the bottom of my list of From Software games. It can't hide its masochism and loves sticking needles up its dick. Do you see what I mean now when I say that these DLCs are good content for their launch asking price of $10? Because I say this earnestly. Sinh is a genuinely excellent fight, and still holds up to this day. A key aspect that makes him so impressive is that he is a good dragon boss fight when we were in a From Software era of mixed dragon bosses. And I can proudly say that he is just as good as Kalameet in Dark Souls 1. I do like Kalameet just a bit more, mainly because I think he looks a lot cooler, but in terms of mechanics, they're both really good. One thing that Sinh does a lot better than Kalameet is the fact that he does a lot more flying around in the air, making him feel like a real dragon. Now, to be fair, in a very wise manner, From Software damaged Kalameet's wings so players wouldn't question why he wasn't flying around. But I have to say, the fact that this guy has proper attacks in the air and with his ground-based combat is very, very impressive. It can be annoying with dragon fights if you feel like they are sticking in the air for too long, but I don't think this issue arises here. And yes, his ground-based attacks are slightly less special, but they still reach a really consistent quality that you wouldn't find in Dark Souls 2's base game. And yeah, we did just get off a real shitty boss, but the fact that these DLC packs were fairly priced with high quality bosses like this really highlights that FromSoft knew a lot of the content in the base game was mid, or they listened to fan feedback. I say this as honestly as possible. Great job From Software. Also, something that players may find annoying is his toxic debuff he can apply to the player. I usually like this sort of thing if it's not done just for the sake of difficulty. With our rock-solid dragon, I think it fits him pretty well, as he clearly has it a part of his kit, and you can even see it when he does his really cool wake-up animation when the fight starts. There's only one downside to this fight, and it's something that most players can stomach, but by God, it's pretty annoying to me. I didn't deal with it during this playthrough, but I did deal with this mechanic when I did this playthrough 3 months ago for a separate video, and it's the fact that your weapon will probably break during this fight. A weapon, and even something like upgrading your armor, are mechanics of the past, and absolutely no one has missed them. My weapon potentially breaking during this fight will not take away from this epic-ass dragon. Midir was the Dragon King prior to Baal, but Sinh and Kalameet are brothers that started awesome dragon fights, and these two should not be lost to time. The second of these really shitty boss runbacks is Blue Smelter Demon, because why wouldn't it be? Because what a spit in the face this is to fans of the game. From Software allowed you to pay for this trash, this terrible, boring reuse that's nothing more than a shitty waste of your time with nothing meaningful in return. Blue Smelter Demon and the runback as a whole is some of the most disrespectful content that I've ever seen in a video game. But in an attempt to be fair, boss runbacks in the older games, including Dark Souls 2, is usually something I can kind of ignore because it was a thing of its time. I also understand that it does inflate the runtime of these games, which may be a sad tactic From Software had to use to add on total hours played. But what this is, in a paid DLC, is nothing more than a piece of shit. And don't worry, I love Elden Ring, but I will absolutely bitch, moan, complain, and yap about the terrible runback to our great Dragon Lord. Blue Smelter Demon is a lazy reuse, but he's not even a fun reuse. A fun reuse would be something like Champion Gundyr. He adds new stuff to play with, and whatever is new with this version of Smelter Demon, I cannot see it. The only thing I do see is that they pumped up his damage and health for a late game character, but they also kept the shitty hitboxes that we saw in the first fight. I have seen on Reddit threads that his attacks are slightly more delayed, so maybe I am just adapting well to this fight, but if it is there, I think it's pretty negligible. It honestly feels like the same fight, but blue, and it has a terrible runback. The DLC that Blue Smelter Demon is in is without a doubt the best DLC in Dark Souls 2. I just wish they removed him because it would be adding more in my mind. So I do have to say that this fight and everything that's surrounding it is just flat out plain awful. From Software, you did a great job with ditching boss runbacks in Shadow of the Erdtree, so let's keep it that way. And don't even think about bringing back whatever Dark Souls 2 introduced. Fume Knight is a gem of a boss, and he's another badass knight that you're supposed to enjoy similar to Artorias. The Souls games have always done a great job making fun and engaging knights like this. Each iteration of the Dark Souls games always has a few really good knights. The Fume Knight is up there with Artorias, although Gale is still my favorite. I really can't get over how good Dark Souls 2's DLC is, as the level leading up to the Fume Knight was one of the better ones in the series as well, because FromSoft brought back what I loved about the base game. Proper level exploration affecting the boss, and it's the most relevant here. Not only is Fume Knight one of the hardest bosses in this game, but he also has the most punishing repercussions for improper level exploration. Occasionally throughout levels, and in the zone right before you enter the boss fog door, you will have an opportunity to use smelter wedges that are specifically affecting this boss fight. Depending on how many of these totems you have not destroyed, Fume Knight will get a heal near the end of his boss fight. This works on so many levels, either forcing players to thoroughly explore or suffer the consequences. It also makes for a great challenge run if you want to add a bit of extra challenge to an already challenging boss. This is going to sound like a bit of a skill issue, but if there was going to be an argument for a boss to be too hard, it would be Fume Knight. This guy has everything in all of the best ways, and I fucking love it. He has fast swipe attacks in his right hand and big, meaty attacks with his greatsword. Just look at how much of a fucking badass this dude is. He wields 2 weapons, each with a different weight. He almost feels like 2 bosses in one, as you have to consciously understand that he does have the best of both worlds with fast attacks and slow, heavy hitting attacks. Now, what I struggle with the most in this fight is oddly enough his boss arena. I know it sounds a bit stupid, and I do have to spoil the bad ending of Sekiro to show my point. So, with the bad ending in Sekiro, Ishin does a great job at controlling his boss arena and will not allow you to heal if you are within a mid-range of him. Wolf has to completely disengage or he will be punished by Ishin for healing. Fume Knight kept catching me with improper heals when I was not at full distance. I love that idea, and From Software knows how to use that intelligently, as the final optional boss in Sekiro has the exact idea in his 3rd phase. It makes you feel cramped and claustrophobic as you are in a tight arena with a huge motherfucker. It's like that one scene in the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire. You do not want to be locked in with some of these guys as they will blast your ass. You may think I'd be done praising this guy by now as I am a certified Dark Souls 2 hater, but his 2nd phase somehow makes him even cooler. Oh god, maybe I'm not a certified Dark Souls 2 hater anymore. I'm getting intrusive thoughts, this isn't good. His 2nd phase turns his greatsword on fire and even has a few added moves. Let me just quickly sum up how good this fight is. He's better than the final boss in Elden Ring's DLC. To be fair, I have not yet played the updated fight that From Software did, but if a boss that is this old is better than what most would consider From Software's best game, then they really struck gold with this fight. I would give his moveset a high A tier ranking, but with the level and boss intertwined gimmicks, this boss is an S tier boss. I like the Darklurker slightly more, but I'm going to just admit it. I'm 100% biased towards duo bosses. This boss is absolutely fantastic, and he's up there with Artorias. If you are a fan of Souls, this boss should be experienced, even if it is just once, because I promise you, you will not regret it. So, here's the thing with Dark Souls 2 runbacks. They're usually done with a pretty bad boss that can be a recommended skip if the boss runback is just too annoying to handle. No one wants to get gangbanged, you've already fought Smelter Demon, and you deserve a special place in hell. All of these fights can be skipped and you wouldn't miss much of anything, but FromSoft had the grand idea, the $1 million idea to shove one of the better bosses in the game behind a terrible ass runback. Just to give you an idea of how bad this runback is, there's a YouTube video with around 61,000 views, simply showing you the most optimal way to skip the runback. It's awful. It's a shame that it's this bad, because for some, Sir Alonne is regarded as one of the better fights in this game, even the best. He's not my favorite fight, but he is in the top 3, and he does have some downsides that I do want to talk about. I don't find his moveset variety to be as interesting as Fume Knight. Sir Alonne has a lot of samurai swipes, slashes, and Sekiro Makuri counters, and that's all great stuff. I just happen to enjoy what Fume Knight offered more. But for 1v1 duelist vs duelist boss fight, he's without a doubt my 2nd favorite duel in the game. The real downside he has is that he crowns some of the worst hitboxes that I experienced in Dark Souls 2. I have a strength build brain IRL, and I stopped thinking once my build was completed and didn't fully level adaptability. For some, a cardinal Dark Souls 2 sin. And while I was fighting him with low adaptability, I was dying to some of the most frustrating bullshit bad hitboxes. The one that would catch me every time is his powered up thrust move. This would hit me almost no matter what. These terrible hitboxes were made even more punishing with how horrendous the boss runback is, and Sir Alonne is arguably the hardest boss in the game. I ended up having to respec so I could not die to these hitboxes, and funnily enough, I beat him on my first try with high adaptability. The biggest gripe that I have with Sir Alonne is the fact that he's so fast that I always felt like I was flipping a coin if he would allow me to heal or not. I would end up doing a proper dodge and right after attempting to heal, just for him to not allow me to get my heal off, since Dark Souls 2 has the slowest Estus strength that I've ever seen. It's like watching an old person eat their food. It's absolutely miserable. Your character in Dark Souls 2 takes longer than forever to bring out their flask, but it also doesn't fully heal you immediately like it does in the other games. It's a fast build-up of health. This was the only time it was starting to get frustrating, as Sir Alonne is the madness of this game, where he pushes the peak speed that Dark Souls 2 can handle. Some may say, just use life gems, forehead, and to that I say, no. Life gems are not that viable in the really late game versus the hardest bosses in Dark Souls 2, because your health bar is so huge and you will need to break at least 3 or 4 to get any real value. And with how much of a distance he can cover with his mobility, I found them to be quite useless here. But with those gripes out of the way, he's good, but he's not my favorite. His rhythm doesn't feel like it's fluctuating enough, as he mainly does have swipes and thrusts as his main moves. He does have other moves, but you will see a repetition of the same swipes throughout his fight, which really does make his boss rhythm get stale if you've been stuck here for a little while. Dodge the same couple of moves I've seen plenty of times, attack once, rinse and repeat. I was having the exact same complaint with the final boss in Elden Ring's DLC's first phase. It didn't feel varied enough, and besides the triple slash, which has now been fixed, I was able to dodge every single attack that was thrown at me, and it didn't become a tense duel until phase 2. Something that I cannot forget to mention is the characterization of this boss. His boss arena is beautiful, his music is fantabulous, as Yuka Kitamura never missed when she was at From Software, and best of all, he has a unique animation if you kill him without taking a single hit. I'm not even close to being skilled enough to pull this off, but small things like that make me appreciate him slightly more. I think he's good, but he's not the best boss in Dark Souls 2, but that's also okay. The DLC and Darklurkers in the base game are top tier From Software bosses, and while Dark Souls 2 does get beat up a lot, it does have a handful of pretty good bosses, and this is one of them. Well, if it ain't the invisible cunt. Aava is another Dark Souls 2 boss that has the level design intertwined with the fight itself. You will most likely fight Aava as soon as you enter the final Dark Souls 2 DLC, and will quickly learn that something is off, and you should worry about her later. Throughout this video, I've made it clear that I love these ideas in Dark Souls 2, and I would say this is another success within a batch of successes. Dragonrider did it the worst, which doesn't surprise me at all, honestly, because that fight is pretty bad, but Aava does it pretty well. Sadly, that's all the positivity I can say about her, as her actual moveset doesn't click with me. I think it's an all-around pretty boring moveset. She has the standard claw swipes, a kitty cat pounce, and a few other oddities like how she can summon icicles, but it just doesn't feel entertaining to fight. A boss such as the Mother of Fingers in Shadow of the Erdtree may not be the funnest boss to interact with, but with how odd and creative she looks, that's where the joy of the fight comes into play. The thing is, this fight should have been an A-tier fight at the bare minimum, and I kind of wonder if this DLC had a rushed development as, well, let's talk about Aava 2, Lud and Zallen. So let me tell you something about myself. I like to complain. I like to bitch and moan and act as a fucking hater. Bitching about these two non-invisible cunts and frigid outskirts is going to be a steak dinner for me, because whoever passed this idea off at From Software needs to be put on a list and thoroughly examined. Frigid Outskirts is content that does not come from a AAA world-class studio. It comes from a lack of time, which is what I suspect, as this DLC is easily the worst Dark Souls 2 DLC, or it comes from a lack of a proper vision of what makes Souls games fun. Dying to these bullshit reindeers and long-ass runbacks where you roleplay as fucking Daredevil is not fun. It's hard, but it's not fun. I can't see shit, and it's annoying. This is so goddamn garbage, I simply cannot believe that this was put into the game. The only good part about this fucking content is the fact that the community has rallied together towards the frigid outskirts, and literally no one will ever defend it. Even the most die-hard Dark Souls 2 fans that think it's the best in the series will not defend this fucking garbage. It wasn't even a well-thought-out idea. It was just a poor execution and a poor idea. Everything about Frigid Outskirts is poor. And you know what? I think one singular bonfire would fix all of this. If you simply placed some good extrinsic rewards in this barren white asshole of a field, then I may explore it if there was just a bonfire right next to the boss room so I can be done with it. We've all played through a Souls game where you chug through a tedious level because it has good extrinsic rewards. I will explore the whole Dark Souls 3 Poisonous Swamp because it has good rewards if my memory serves me correctly. But with this being the last DLC in Dark Souls 2, I'm done. I have everything I need. Get me to the fucking boss. And with how piss poor this place is, it suffers from what Sir Alonne did, and the shit-ass runback does affect the boss quality. Oh wait, did I say the word quality by mistake? I need to edit that out, let me take a note. Because there is no fucking quality. Why should I be penalized because of From Software's sloppiness? And I'm only going to do this once for this whole video series and not beat this boss. This boss is so bad, this runback is so terrible, that I refuse to finish it. It is simply a waste of time, and I earnestly believe that this DLC was rushed out the door. It's ugly, there's too much snow, 2 out of the 3 bosses suck, it's not good. I got a lot of pushback during my DLC video when I said this DLC was the worst, and I have to say, I still stand by what I said. This shit is fucking awful, and it's the one Dark Souls 2 DLC that's worth skipping for the sloppiness of what is on offer. Okay, I think I got my rants out for now. Burnt Ivory King is our last DLC boss in Dark Souls 2, and I have to say, I'm kind of sad. This video has had a personal character arc where I find the good in Dark Souls 2. I am a certified Dark Souls 2 hater, but when I would sit down and review my footage, I would rant about most of the base game, level design, the bad bosses, but the DLC packs are really good. If you combine the two good DLCs in Dark Souls 2 and use ashes from Dark Souls 3 instead of this shit, I'd say it's top tier content and almost as good as Shadow of the Erdtree. And while this DLC was clearly rushed out the door, they did put all their eggs into the Burnt Ivory King. You already know what I love about this fight, right? It's yet another way From Software connected level exploration and the final boss of this DLC, and this DLC does it the best because of its excellent ludo narrative that I'll tell you about. Throughout this level you can find 4 Elden Ring fan White Knights. These White Knights will die for you. They won't let anyone say anything bad about you, and if someone does say something, they will parade you with hate comments and insults, letting you know that you are objectively wrong. They sure are the best. Where the ludo narrative really kicks in is where the boss fight itself starts. The Black Knights spawn in, which are the Elden Ring haters. Even though they are in the same community, they are seemingly at war with each other for no good reason. Eventually, both of them will lose steam, and the real final boss of the DLC starts. Gee, isn't that an awesome ludo narrative experience? Okay, I'll drop the act now, and I will say that I do love the Battle Royale feel that is at the start of the Burnt Ivory King boss fight. I do think that it can get a bit tedious if you die more than 3 or so times, but the first couple of times you attempt this boss fight, it's a lot of fun seeing these AIs duke it out. This boss fight is every example of what Shadow of the Erdtree was missing with some of its bosses: spectacle, scale, and presentation. Relana is my second favorite fight in Shadow of the Erdtree, but I cannot deny, her boring ass level doesn't help the fact that she has no cutscene, and no good build-up such as Baal, and a boring ass boss arena. Like, look at how fucking badass this is when the king himself walks into the battlefield. His AI doesn't immediately turn on, and he walks in like he owns the place, with complete and utter confidence. His really good presentation isn't the only thing he has going for him, as this boss fight is a great example of why these games do not need easy modes. Because there is an intended experience of dying and being challenged, but you can make these games almost as easy as you'd like. When you have the maximum number of White Knights for this boss, he will go down quite easily if you have good enough RNG. The kill that you are seeing here was the first attempt on this character, but I do know that if I went in with the fewest amount of knights possible, I would be getting my ass slammed. However, I do wonder if this boss fight could have been made slightly harder, as his moveset is not bad by any means, and this is the final DLC boss in Dark Souls 2. He has a really cool weapon that he uses. About halfway through the fight, he turns his weapon into a long staff made of light and starts to fight somewhat similar to Sir Alonne. It's really well made, and I can't believe that From Software did it. Dark Souls 2 has a mediocre base game, but this DLC does bring it up to the Souls standard, and From Software flipped the bad of the base game into a great experience. Well, we're back in the base game of Dark Souls 2. It was fun while it lasted, because the base game sucks. I have regressed back to a hater, and I don't care. These two aren't bosses, they are simply mini-bosses with a boss health bar at the bottom. Part of this is my fault as I am completely overleveled for this fight, but I don't care. Their movesets are boring and they don't do much of anything. The only good idea that's in this fight is the fact that the other will be revived if you somehow don't kill the other before the revive happens. I had to hold myself back just so this exact thing could happen. For the final set of bosses in Dark Souls 2, you'd think From Software would make these guys an unforgettable experience. Instead, we get 2 mini-bosses with a boss health bar. Nashandra was the true final boss in Dark Souls 2 before Scholor the First Sin came out. So, just to be clear, this boss was an acceptable final boss for Dark Souls 2 standards. Fucking pathetic. Nashandra will act like she is worth a damn by summoning cursed orbs that surround you, but none of that matters. None of it. It's too easy to acknowledge these orbs as nothing more than an annoyance and go about your day whacking at her body since her health pool isn't high by any means. Really, she kind of just looks cool and that's about it. That's really all the positivity I have to say about her. Final bosses can be on the easier side more for lore, but they always try to end it with a mechanical fight as a last hurrah. All you have to do is look back at old King Alonne in Demon Souls and you would see what I'm talking about. Instead, the final bosses of Dark Souls 2 are shit, and shit. Do you remember what I said about the final bosses being more of a lore boss? Yeah, Aldia is just that. I would be a lot more forgiving towards Aldia if we had a good set of bosses in the final boss arena, but that is not the case. Aldia may have good lore or music, but mechanically we have nothing here. Most of the time when you are hitting this boss, you will be taking chip damage to fire or running away from trees that are summoned from the ground. I do respect that this is a free add-on to Scholor, but it's just not that great. It's a bad finale to Dark Souls 2, filled with 2 mediocre at best bosses in the same boss arena. So with the final set of bosses done, we can wrap this video up. Dark Souls 2 is one of the hardest games to love, and it's the different one in the Souls family. It does have good content in the game, but almost all of the content that is in this game is flawed. Some of the really good bosses have terrible runbacks. The level design in the base game is really bad, life gems should have been nerfed, the last set of bosses and the final DLC are both pretty bad. Dark Souls 1 is an extremely flawed game too. I don't want to act like I am hiding that fact. Now, we all know the issues with Dark Souls 1. The second half is miserable to play. The level design isn't as good, the bosses are bad. It is a drastic change in quality. And for most of my life, I have been a Dark Souls 2 hater. But I don't really know if I would classify myself as a hater anymore. Rather, Dark Souls 2 is a game that I don't think is bad, I just don't want to replay the game that much. But in its very own way, Dark Souls 2 may be the most impressive game FromSoft has made. As there has always been these rumors surrounding the game that the game was soft rebooted within From Software 18 months before launch, and the game was quickly made. If that is the case, Dark Souls 2 and the bosses are pretty awesome for what they are. And yeah, the bosses are without a doubt the best part of Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 1 focuses more on having thrilling level and world design, while Dark Souls 2 keeps things on the simple side with Majula being the central hub, and the game expands in width. I also did a little experiment. I looked back at my Dark Souls 1 footage and said to myself, how many bosses are in Dark Souls 1 that I can at least enjoy? I don't have to love them, but I can hop on and say, yeah, they're alright. How many do you think I picked? Well, it wasn't many, and it was 6. 4 of them are in the DLC, with the only 2 that I give a damn about in the base game being the Bellfry Gargoyles alongside Ornstein and Smell, which just so happens that the 2 in the base game are duo bosses. I can't deny the fact that Dark Souls 2 has more enjoyable bosses for me to fight. Dark Souls 1 reaches higher highs, but it's not by much. Dark Souls 2 has overall more content with its 3 DLC packs, and 2 out of those 3 are really where it shines. And I didn't think I liked that many Dark Souls 2 bosses, but I kind of do. And when I reviewed my Dark Souls 2 footage, I found 9 bosses in this game that I do enjoy. Both of these numbers are admittedly small, but in my defense I've beaten every single boss in the franchise, meaning that I've been spoiled by the highs of Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3's bosses. So I have to swallow my pride and say, yeah, in their own way they do hold up. There is a lot of trash here, a lot more than Dark Souls 1, but when I look past that I can see a lot of great bosses here. So that's my take on Dark Souls 2. I have evolved and I am no longer a hater. The Dark Souls 2 fans can take their W. They've definitely earned it, as Dark Souls 2 may not be a masterpiece, but it's not a terrible game, and it's better than most Souls-likes on the market, and that's worth something.